Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you so much for joining us and taking some time out of your day to participate in our webinar. You should see the slides up on your webinar page, and there are some handouts. We sent out a link earlier in the chat box with a link to the handouts and where the slides are posted. If you have questions about those, go ahead and check that chat box and see if you have the link. There also, you can find a handout section when you signed into the webinar, so you should be able to find everything there. If you have questions, go ahead and in the question box, you can put those in and we will do our best to help you. So I just want to thank you again for joining us for our What Counts as Evidence webinar, talking about making decisions for instruction and intervention within an MTSS system. We have a couple of great panelists with us, and I'll introduce them in a second. But you can see the slide up now gives you an image of where you should put questions if you need support. Go ahead and direct any questions you have in there, and one of our webinar team members will try to assist you as soon as possible to help you work through and make sure you have access to everything you need. So logistical components aside, I'm excited to talk to introduce our panelists that we have today. We've got Rebecca Zametta-Edmonds, Allison Gandhi, and Lynn Holt-Heidi on to talk to you about levels of evidence and making decisions within an MTSS framework. And we're going to go ahead and move the slides forward. And before we get started, we want to get a sense of who's on with us. So you should see a polling participant poll with some questions about who you are. You'll see it over in the poll section. If you can tell us sort of what role you have in supporting student learning, it takes a second or two for the polling information to come in. But we want to know if you're a technical assistance provider, if you're faculty, if you're someone like a state or district school administrator, if you're a teacher, or if you're other. So while you're polling, I'm going to go ahead and watch the data come in. And after this poll comes in, we'll get a sense of who's on with us, and then I'll pass it over to Allison Gandhi, who will begin the presentation. And it looks like we have almost half of you are teachers. 40% are teachers or school staff, and the next biggest percentage are state and district school administrators. So that's takes about 70% of who we have on with us. So that information is really helpful, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Allison Gandhi, who's going to get started with our presentation.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. We are really happy to be delivering this webinar on what we think is a really important topic, and that is evidence and just the different understandings of evidence that we all bring to our work. And as I'm sure you all know, the term evidence is being used more and more in discussions about education and the different instructional practices and interventions that we choose to implement. And there is increasing pressure on practitioners at all levels to be implementing practices that are evidence-based, and different policies are holding people accountable for this. Meanwhile, though, we don't really have a common understanding of what counts as evidence and how to make sure we are really making decisions that are grounded in the right kinds of evidence. So in our role as TA providers through NCII, the Cedar Center, as well as NCSI, the National Center on Systemic Improvement, we need to be able to support our audiences in making these decisions. So today we want to share with you a framework for thinking about evidence, and this framework is grounded in the notion of a multi-tier system of support, or MTSS. And the reason why we're using MTSS as our framework is that we find that in our work, when we do give guidance about evidence-based practices, the guidance that we give is different depending on whether we're talking about practices at Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. So the overall goal for this webinar is really primarily just to lessen the anxiety around evidence-based practices, or EBPs as we're going to call them. And we want to do this first by making the case that EBPs, or there can and should be some flexibility in terms of how we define EBPs across the different tiers in MTSS. Second, we want to share with you some resources that you can use to select EBPs that are appropriate to your needs. And we're going to talk about resources in two ways. We're going to talk about core instructional practice, so what we would consider as Tier 1 in MTSS. And then we'll talk about it also in terms of intervention, so what we would consider Tiers 2 and 3. So I'm going to start by describing just some of the federal requirements around EBPs in education. And first we have the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, that was just recently passed. And this law really has some very specific language in it about how evidence should be used to support the selection of practices. So first of all, the law says that in their efforts to turn around low-performing schools, states need to implement evidence-based interventions. And second, the law actually includes language on different categories of evidence, which I've included on this slide. So strong evidence, according to this law, means that a practice is supported by at least one randomized study. So this is really considered sort of the most rigorous kind of evidence. Moderate evidence would mean that a practice is supported by at least one quasi-experimental study. Promising evidence means that a practice is supported by at least one correlational study with pretest as covariates. And then there's a fourth category that really just says that there can be programs that have a rationale based on high-quality research or a positive evaluation that shows the practice is likely to improve student or other relevant outcomes. And any intervention that a state would use to turn around its lowest performing schools needs to have evidence that falls into at least one of the top three categories. So, we think this is good guidance, especially because it's fairly clear. It really lays out what they mean by evidence. But from our point of view, there's still a problem in that there are many practices that are used in schools, and many of them are good practices, but for various reasons, they don't lend themselves to the kinds of studies that are required to meet these really rigorous levels of evidence, especially when you're talking about the strong evidence. And so we would argue that there needs to be a little bit of flexibility there, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So meanwhile, OSEP has recently launched the Results-Driven Accountability Initiative, or RDA. And what RDA does is it holds states accountable for not only compliance indicators, and by that I mean things like timely evaluations or disproportionality, but now states are also being held accountable for student results. So states need to develop and implement what's called a State Systemic Improvement Plan, otherwise known as the SIP. And in that plan, they have to identify a measurable child-level outcome that's going to be their target that they have to achieve in the next 3 years. And this is called the State Identified Measurable Results, or SIMR. This outcome, this result, SIMR, needs to be a child-level outcome, or if it's the Part C program, it could be a family-level outcome. It can't be a process or a system result, and it can be either a single result, so something really narrow like fourth grade reading achievement, or it can be a cluster of related results, so something like reading achievement across multiple grades. And it has to be based on an analysis of data. So the OSEP guidance states that in their State Systemic Improvement Plans, or SIPs, states have to outline the specific interventions and practices that they will implement to achieve their SIMR, and these interventions need to be evidence-based. Now, what's interesting, however, is that the OSEP guidance around what it means to be evidence-based is a little bit less clear than ESSA. And really, what they have said about it is just that it needs to be based on the best available research. So that does allow some flexibility in terms of how you might interpret this. However, states do need to describe what that evidence is in their SIPs, and so there is a need for better understanding of what counts as evidence. Okay, so the difference between these two major federal policies that I just described in terms of how they define EBPs and the criteria for EBPs does illustrate one of the really major challenges that we see, and that is inconsistent terminology and language. The question still sort of remains really, what is an evidence-based practice? So as I just described, you have different language already in the ESSA and in RDA. Also, some of you may be familiar with language that used to be in NCLB, the term scientifically based research, and some groups still use that term. And there are plenty of other sources of guidance out there already about EBPs as well, and they have different definitions and terms also. So for example, the What Works Clearinghouse, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, the CEC quality indicators, And really there are dozens of websites out there that have lists of EBPs. And there are also commercial publishers who also put out their products and call them evidence-based or research-based or promising. And there's many different terms, many different sources, and this can all be very confusing to navigate. So another source of inconsistency is the criteria that are used to deem a practice as evidence-based. So all of these organizations that produce lists of EBPs use slightly different criteria. And some examples of the different factors that are considered include, for example, the quality of the evidence. So what is the design of the study that was conducted on a particular practice? Second would be the direction of the results, meaning did they get positive results or negative results, and the magnitude, how big were the results? Third would just be how much evidence exists, how many studies have been conducted on this. And then fourth, sometimes it's important to consider the source of evidence. Are we talking about a practice that's only been researched by the developers of the practice or by an external evaluator? And then many of these organizations have some kind of combination of these criteria when determining whether a practice is evidence-based. So as practitioners, we need to make decisions about which of these organizations to trust and what do we value in terms of criteria for deciding that something is evidence-based. So we wanted to take a pause here and just put out a poll question, and we want you all to take a moment to think about what is most important to you when you're choosing an evidence-based practice. So thinking about this, is it important to you that it's been examined using the most rigorous research design? Or is it important that it has a very large body of research showing positive results? Is it important that maybe the research is not a large body, but it's just never been shown to have negative results? Other criteria might be just that the practice has worked well for your kids. You've seen it work, or you've seen it work for your colleagues' kids. Or maybe it's just important that it's aligned very well to your students' needs. And it may be all of these things that are important to you. I'm sure it is. But if you had to choose the most important thing, what would it be? So if you can take a moment to look through this poll question and answer it, that would be helpful.
It looks like about 75% of you have voted, and we are at about 60% that say it has a large body of research, the second option showing positive, and about 27% with the practice aligned to my students' needs. Everywhere else is about 3 to 5%.
Great. Okay, so that's actually really interesting. So it's interesting to hear that most people want to see that large body of research. But I think the point here is just to show that, there's a lot that goes into deciding that a practice is evidence-based. It's more than just having the most rigorously designed research study. And we worry sometimes that we've kind of gotten to the point where we're a little bit too rigid in terms of how we define EBPs. Okay, so here on this slide, this is just sort of a little example of an extreme situation that, maybe a little too extreme, but to some degree it reflects a little bit of what's going on, a little bit of just taking this too seriously. So here we have a teacher who's saying, well, I can tell you're struggling with fractions, Tony, but there aren't any EBPs for kids in your grade, so just check back in a few years, right? And this obviously is not realistic. If we don't have any EBPs available for a particular topic, we can't just sit back and do nothing, right? We have to have some alternatives. So it's really important for practitioners to understand not only what EBPs are, but also how can they benefit from them. Also, what are the rules for implementing them? To what extent can practitioners adapt them to meet their own specific needs and their context? And then if they do adapt them, how do they monitor the implementation and gather their own evidence so they can be confident that it will still be effective? Because an evidence-based practice is really much more than just identifying something that's been validated through research. There's a lot more that happens after you take that practice and bring it into your classroom and adapt it and make sure that it's working for you. Okay, so coming back to the federal policy discussion, we have the situation now where states are dealing with not necessarily conflicting guidance, but definitely different guidance from these two laws or policies, both in terms of why EBPs are required and also in the language that's used to describe what evidence-based means. And we see this as just a really big roadblock in terms of states being able to have an impact with their work. So what we find, first of all, is sort of on one side, You have the special education people sort of who are working on being compliant with RDA, so they're really going to focus on EBPs that are aligned with their particular goal, their SIMR, and they are going to focus on this idea of best available research, right? Then over on the general ed side, you have people who are focused on maybe more on low-performing schools and needing to identify evidence-based interventions to implement in those schools, and they're going to be looking for interventions backed by really rigorous studies because they want to follow the guidance in ESSA, right? But meanwhile, these two groups really have the same aim, which is just to get good practices in the schools to improve results for the lowest achieving students. But we're finding a lot of times that these groups are having trouble talking to each other. And really, we think that's just because they have different frames of mind and terms that they're using around evidence-based practices. So what we wanted to do is suggest some common language and a common framework that states and districts can use when thinking about EBPs. So it occurred to us that MTSS could be a really useful framework to help stakeholders in our states come together around EBPs, and for a couple reasons. So first, MTSS is just becoming so much more common. It actually comes up in the ESSA legislation several times as a strategy that is encouraged, especially for addressing literacy. And we know that many states are looking at MTSS as an overall school improvement strategy, so it does really have the potential to bring special educators and general educators together. But more importantly, I think MTSS is really helpful because it is explicit about the fact that instruction is different across tiers. And so the practice that we're talking about when we say evidence-based practice is also going to be different. So just going back to the language issue, we still have that question, well, what is a practice? It's not really clear. Are we talking about an intervention program? Are we talking about an instructional strategy or a process of some kind? And all of this language is really important because the type of evidence that you need to feel confident that you're making a good choice is going to vary depending on what we mean by practice. And so we think MTSS can help to clarify these things. So on this slide, we have a table that includes some detail on how we see the practice as being different in each tier of MTSS. So I'm going to just walk through this. So in the first tier, so this is your primary level of MTSS, this is where you have your comprehensive research-based curriculum. And what's important to note here is that at Tier 1, we're not talking about packaged intervention programs. We're talking about a much broader curriculum that includes many different instructional strategies and practices that are brought together, and overall the curriculum is also covering a specific range of content that is aligned to grade level standards. And this instruction or this curriculum is delivered class-wide. Usually at Tier 1 you're progress monitoring about once per term and you're serving all your students. Okay? Moving to Tier 2, now this is where we're talking more about those kinds of packaged intervention programs. These are more standardized programs that are targeting small groups of students, typically between 3 to 7 students. You would be progress monitoring at least once a month, and these are your at-risk students. At Tier 3, now we're talking about individualized intervention that's based on student data. And what's really important to note here is that the practice at Tier 3 is actually different for each single kid that you're working with, right? So that makes it very difficult to take some sort of standard evidence-based practices and apply them. So now you're talking about usually one student at a time, you're progress monitoring at least weekly, and these are your students with the most intensive needs. So now, given that we know sort of what are the varying ways in which a practice is defined by tier, so what does that mean for evidence? Okay, so this slide is sort of a summary of how we're thinking about how evidence might vary a little bit for each of the tiers. And my co-presenters are going to take this and talk about this in more detail, but just to give you a preview and a summary, for Tier 1, again, this is our comprehensive research-based curriculum. So when we think about what evidence we need for the practice here at Tier 1, well, we need to know, first of all, are we covering the critical content? And second, we need to know and feel good that the instructional practices and strategies we're using on their own each have evidence of efficacy. When you move to Tier 2, now we're talking about the standardized interventions. Here we need to have evidence that, first of all, the intervention is aligned to the skills that you are targeting, and second, that the standardized program that you're working with itself has demonstrated efficacy. And then the third tier, this is where we're talking about individualized instruction based on student data. Here the evidence is really about that student data again. So are you individualizing the intervention and you're bringing in strategies, and you're making all these decisions based on frequent progress monitoring data that you're collecting. That's really the best evidence that you have at Tier 3. And one thing, just before I move on and pass this on to my next presenter, one thing I think that's important to point out here is that at the Tier 2 level, these are really the kinds of practices that lend themselves to those really high, most rigorous standards of evidence. So the kinds of evidence that the What Works Clearinghouse and that ESSA really talks a lot about. So these are, again, those packaged programs that you can fairly easily implement with Fidelity, and because of that, you can test them with experimental studies. And so these are the practices that are the most likely to be labeled as EBPs, because for the most part, the way we understand EBPs right now is driven by these very rigorous levels of evidence. Now, on the other hand, when you look at practices that are implemented at Tiers 1 and 3, so when you're talking about instructional strategies or this idea of individualizing an intervention based on data, you can't really conduct randomized control trials very easily on those kinds of practices because they vary so much and they're kind of fluid. But that, of course, doesn't mean that these are not important practices to implement. So we just need to be more flexible in thinking about, again, this issue of what counts as evidence at Tiers 1 and 3. So that's what my co-presenters are going to talk about a little bit more. And I'm going to pass this over first to Lynn Holtine, who's going to talk about core instructional practice.
Thank you, Allison. What a very nice setup. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm excited and in some ways validated to see such an interest in this topic. So I think it's important to know my perspective as we enter into the piece about Tier 1 or core instruction and what perspective I'm coming from. I'm a special education teacher at heart. I spent a lot of my career in secondary transition and preparing students for the adult world that awaits them. But about 10 years ago, I sort of bridged over into the general education world in some support through a federal center that was funded jointly by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the Office of Special Education to really look at teacher quality issues. And it was in that bridge, that jumping over, that it really started to give me a really good perspective of what the complexity is in terms of instructional practice when it comes to the lens that you're looking through in the student populations that you're serving and who's guiding the way in which you're supposed to be providing instruction. That really, that experience really helped me see from a general ed and a special education perspective of what instruction does and needs to look like and what teachers are experiencing. I now also have the opportunity to work with two federally funded centers within the Office of Special Education Programs that help provide supports to states to implement the things that Allison set us up with in terms of RDA and the State Systemic Improvement Plan. But as she very well articulated, we're all in this together because our goal is ultimately to ensure that all students, students with disabilities included, are getting the type of instruction that is going to move the needle towards their growth. So I wanted to lay out that perspective because it's within that perspective that you'll understand why I have appropriately coined this section of the presentation about mixed messages and mixed opportunities, depending on who is speaking to you. Allison set us up nicely and laid out some terminology in terms of evidence-based practices, research-based practices, scientifically based, things that I think that we're all familiar with hearing. I'm going to throw out another term that, depending on your orientation, you may or may not have heard before, and one of those is high leverage practices. This is practices that were identified through Deborah Ball at the University of Michigan and are really resonating in the general education world. There's 19 practices that are really important that all teachers need to know and be able to do in order to work successfully with students in their classrooms. But it is a new term. It may be new to some of you, maybe not to others. But what I found is that all of these terms and the variation in the interpretation of those terms is really leading to mixed messages for teachers in the classroom. When you think about your educator career, you go through preparation, and you're prepared a certain way, and then you enter into certification and licensure where you are assessed to determine your level of knowledge and ability to teach, and that assessment is based on a certain level of expectations around instruction. Then you are potentially evaluated when you're hired and you're in a position, you're evaluated through an educator evaluation system. And there again, there is some basis and constructs within these educator evaluation models that really focus on the type of instruction that you're providing. And then ultimately, hopefully, you're being provided some level of professional learning and support in your career as you're teaching students to help you grow in your practice. And it's within all those different steps that there's so much potential where there's mixed messages about expectations of practice. And it becomes very challenging for teachers in classrooms. If we could just move to the next slide. So what does it feel like for a teacher? And I noted at the very beginning we have a lot of teachers on the webinar today, and hopefully this resonates with you, although sadly it probably does, is that there's a lot of mixed messages about what we should be doing in instruction. And you see the little joke here. I'm not going to read it because I think you see it, but the general idea is that teachers are getting mixed messages and they're getting caught in the middle. So depending if you're coining the term as high leverage practices or evidence-based practices or whatever it is, what they're not understanding or not being able to do then is to be able to provide instruction well because they're getting mixed messages. They may be being supported differently and they may be evaluated differently. So which target are we trying to meet? And I think, as Allison said, we're all trying to meet the same target in that we're trying to provide the level of instruction that helps students learn and figuring out how do we collect the level of evidence that we need in order to determine, are my students learning in my classroom? And if they're not, what do I need to do differently and how does my instruction need to be modified or intensified in order for all my students to be able to achieve the target that we set out? But right now, because we have all these different terminology and different levels of expectations around instruction, I feel like teachers are getting caught in the middle in terms of these varying expectations, which leads them to the next slide. Closing the door, burying, blocking it, doing whatever we can to just work with our kids. As a teacher, as a former teacher, I felt it often. Just let me work with students, let me do this well. But you have people coming in to evaluate you, you have professional development providers, you have all these folks coming in and helping you support student learning. But if you're getting mixed messages, it's not feeling very much help. And this is why we, Allison and I and Rebecca and others, have really started thinking about this in terms of how do we come to some common ground so that way we can make it clear in terms of expectations of instructional practice that we do know works with the bulk of students. But then most importantly, how do we ensure that teachers are armed with what the resources and the supports they need to really be able to collect and analyze student data to know when a practice, whether it be an evidence-based or high leverage or whatever we want to call it, when a practice works and when it's not working and what do we need to do differently to make sure it works for the bulk of our students. So what is quality tier 1 instruction or core instruction? I think all of us would agree, most likely, that we want shared ownership and accountability for the progress of all students, that we're not segregating out a certain population of students, whether they're in a co-teaching situation, a segregated situation. It doesn't really matter. We just want to make sure that we all own the progress of our students, general education teachers, special ed, et cetera, that all students have access to the curriculum and that they have the opportunity to access the curriculum, the instruction, the assessments in a way that can demonstrate their knowledge or lack thereof. So that way we can figure out what do we need to do differently to ensure that there is indeed access for all students. And again, we want instruction and practices that are effective. We have more diversity in our classrooms today than we've ever had before. And it's hard. Teaching is a hard job. It is a science, and it is difficult when you've got 30 students in your classroom trying to decide which instruction is going to work and what do I do when it doesn't work for a group of students. And that's what we're talking about here. What instruction do we know through evidence is most likely to be most effective with a bulk of students? And if it's not, what do we need to do next? And how do we intensify it to ensure that all students gain access to that curriculum? And of course, the screening and progress monitoring is critically important. And sometimes I think we look over that. But I know as a teacher, I did not look at my data near enough, and I didn't really have the skill set to understand why some of my students weren't learning. And if I didn't know why they weren't learning, I didn't know what I needed to change. And then I didn't have the right support to make sure that I knew how to change in order for my students to do better. And I think every teacher in every classroom, that's our ultimate goal, to ensure our students can learn. So if we're getting mixed messages and we're squabbling, quite frankly, over the terminology, we're missing an opportunity to really help identify the type of instructional practices that we know through evidence do work with students, but then also recognizing that it's not a done deal, it's not a guarantee, that the most important thing that we do is monitor our students' progress to see if it is indeed working and what we need to do next. And then ultimately, if necessary, go to Tier 2 or Tier 3, which Rebecca will talk about here in a few minutes. But when we're looking at 30 students in a classroom, we don't want an inverted triangle where we have more students getting Tier 2 and Tier 3 services than what really should. So that's why core instruction is so critically important. But it's challenging for the reasons that Allison laid out before. It's challenging in these ways. There's variation in context, there's implementation fidelity issues, and there's student characteristic issues. So when we know that we have an evidence base for a particular practice, we know that there's probably a control trial, there's a study, there's something that's going on that does have concern with the level of fidelity and implementation. And the reality of most general education classrooms is that it's very different. The contexts are different, the leadership support's different. All those things make a difference in terms of the fidelity of implementation. So it really does make it challenging at Tier 1 to implement and keep that level of consistency and fidelity in implementation. That all being said, it really does lead into missed opportunities for shared ownership. As a general education teacher, I work with general teachers all the time, and they say, well, I've never really been trained to support students with disabilities. I don't know how to work and support all the diversity in my classrooms. And because sometimes we give mixed messages about high leverage practices, evidence-based practices, we're also sort of segregating the field to some degree to think that practices at Tier 1 or teachers that are providing core instruction really don't know what to do. Where in fact, if we could come to an agreement around what are those high leverage practices or practices at Tier 1 that we know more than likely through research is going to move the needle for kids, and then how do we make sure that the data is collected to know if it's working, we're going to be much farther along. The end result is missed opportunities for shared ownership. We decrease the confidence, as I mentioned before, in teachers at core. And then we end up with having more students referred to Tier 2 and Tier 3, which really isn't very well leveraging the talents and the skills and expertise of your special education teachers in the building if we are not being very purposeful about ensuring that the students are getting the type of instruction at core and all the way through that they need. Next slide. So we do have a poll. I wanted to kind of get to what you perceive in your prospective roles, if you're a teacher at core or if you're a special education teacher or whatever role that you're serving, but what is it that you perceive as a primary challenge in implementing evidence-based practices in core and Tier 1 instruction? So you see some of those things listed here, some of which that I believe you probably heard before, that EDPs place too much emphasis on lower order skills. Again, that they don't align with expectations about core instruction. So if you're implementing an EBP and your educator evaluation model, for example, is not looking at that EBP as quality instruction, you've got a misalignment issue. In some cases, EBPs might be thought to be too difficult to use in the general education classroom because you've got 30 students with a lot of curriculum and coverage that, that needs to happen. There isn't enough time. Of course, that's always a big thing. And then, of course, the students' cultural and language needs are maybe not considered to the level of depth in EBPs. So if you take a moment to vote, and this is a check all that applies, so it doesn't force you to pick one, and you may pick all. That's telling too. But if you could, just pick as many here as you feel are appropriate.
And Lynn, while I'm watching the votes come in for the poll, we did get a couple of questions about who you referenced when you were speaking of the high leverage practices. I thought it was Deborah Ball, but I wanted to double check.
That is true. Deborah Ball.
Okay. And then also if there was a link, it sounded like there was a reference to like a list of the practices or something at kind of the initial slide. If we had access to a link or info, we can get that out to everyone.
I would be happy to do that. As soon as I turn it over to Rebecca, I will go find the link and send it to you, Sarah, and you can put it out. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we're at about 60% voted at this point, and we're split just about evenly between evidence-based practices don't align with expectations, and then there isn't time to teach evidence-based practices and other content. Those are at about 40 and 40% each. And then we have about 28% at the evidence-based practices are too difficult to use in the general ed. So those are our highest three in the polling.
Very good. Very good. And very telling. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for voting and giving your input. Very telling, because I think sometimes when we think about EBPs in the different contexts, it could be perceived as very difficult to do. It could be perceived as outside of content. which, if done well, the high leverage practices and the evidence-based practices can be integrated quite well to meet the needs of students in content. But again, I think this is a telling point that this misalignment in expectations and the lack of understanding and agreement about what HLPs and EBPs need to be implemented in Tier 1 has really caused more confusion in the field. And really the result is, as I said before, that we're kind of paralyzed because we're not sure what instruction we should be doing to meet the needs of students. And I think we're all about making sure that we are. So this is good information. If we could just go on to the next. This comes back to what Allison was saying before. Do we need to have more flexibility around the evidence? And I think we're trying to make the case that there's, what's the risk of doing so? Because at this point, it feels like we're spending a lot of time defining each DBP and what level and so forth, where it's causing a lot of confusion in the field, and teachers are left really in the end result not knowing what to use. We do know what works through our studies. The studies are critically important. Evidence is critically important because we have a lot of expectations set out for our students to prepare them, and so we want to do the best job that we can. That all being said, really thinking through how do you ensure that the instruction at Tier 1 is leveraging what we know about evidence, but then also allowing some level of flexibility in ensuring that and understanding that there's a lot of variables that impact fidelity when you're thinking about core instruction. But at the same time, what are we doing to better prepare and support our teachers to have the data and the progress monitoring mindset and the support within the schools to ensure that we're monitoring if these things are working? Go ahead. And again, schedule, content coverage, these are things, all that impact the fidelity of implementation in your evidence-based practices or in your high leverage practices that really make a big difference in terms of how much time did you have, did instruction incur, were correct screening administration and scoring happening, were the EBPs followed through implementation fidelity, all things that we laid out before. But, where can we land to ensure that we do provide it in a way that general ed teachers and core instruction can happen, that it makes sense, that it feels feasible, that we're supported and we're getting those consistent messages. Those are things that I feel very passionately about because I do see the mixed messages from the different roles that I get the opportunity to play that teachers are feeling. And the end result, the students are the ones that, really miss the opportunity to learn. Go ahead. So we mentioned some resources, and here's some more resources here. And actually, Sarah, here's the link to the high leverage practices that you asked me before that I totally kind of forgot it was here. But Teaching Works.
No, thanks. And we sent that out to everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. I had it already. Anyway, these are different ones. But it is important to look at the high leverage practices through Ball because it is getting a lot of latitude and a lot of leverage in the general education space. And the ETS is working closely with Ball and her colleagues to develop some assessments, performance assessments around these practices. I think it's also important to note that the Cedar Center, which I'll talk about in a moment and describe that, has worked with the Council for Exceptional Children through a number of folks to really take a look at Deborah Ball's high leverage practices and articulate those in a way that makes sense for students with disabilities and special educators. So that work will be coming out, I believe, in the next, I'm not going to promise something out here because I'm not sure, but in the next number of months will be coming out. But there has been some effort to, work around these high leverage practices and see and demonstrate the alignment between the evidence-based practices we purport in special education as well. Next slide. So I wanted to take just a minute to talk a little bit about the Cedar Center because one of the things that was noted in a number of studies, but in a number of different ways, was that the teaching and the practice of evidence-based practices weren't necessarily happening in all preparation coursework. So again, it's not a surprise then that EBPs are hard to implement and that there's maybe a mixed understanding about what they are and how they can be implemented if it's not being taught in preparation programs. And so OSEP had the fortitude to think about ways in which we could improve and enhance preparation programs both at the general ed side and the special ed side to ensure that all teachers and leaders really have a good understanding of what evidence-based practices are, as well as being able to implement them to a level of fidelity. So the Cedar project is a 5-year project that works with state education agencies and educator preparation programs, general ed and special ed, to really think through how do we improve the way in which teachers and leaders are prepared to support students with disabilities, most particularly around the use of evidence-based practices. Go ahead. We, at the onset of the Cedar Center, we did work with a group of researchers to identify the evidence-based standards, and there is a link to the document here, and what you'll find is it very much aligns with the ones that Allison referenced earlier and what is in the ESSA Act that is currently out in terms of the levels of evidence. But what we wanted to do was identify our levels of evidence as we started to create tools and resources for our states and for our preparation programs that we're working with, to ensure that we, too, were looking at the same levels of evidence and trying to be clear in terms of expectations of practice. So you're welcome to take a look at that. I think you will see that it very much aligns with the Council for Exceptional Children evidence-based standards as well. At the onset of Cedar, one of the things we wanted to do was offer tools to preparation programs. So if you come back to what is the primary goal of the Cedar Center, and the primary goal of Cedar was to work alongside state education agencies and educator preparation programs in general ed and special ed to ensure that we're doing a better job of preparing teachers and leaders to support students with disabilities. That's basically the bulk of what the Cedar Center is about. But of course, when you're supporting students with disabilities, or teachers and leaders to support students with disabilities, you have to be able to kind of come to terms on what practices are important that teachers need to know and be able to do. So we created these things called the innovation configurations. And basically, these innovation configurations, there's a number of them, and you can see the link here, that really identify through meta-analysis and through the research and through all of that, what are those essential competencies that teachers need to know and be able to do to implement evidence-based practice as well. So these articulate those, and they're kind of the ground foundation, and they're fairly lengthy for the most part, because when you cite research, it does take a little bit of time to get it all in. But if you flip back to the very back, there's something that's called an innovation configuration, which basically helps preparation program faculty and PD providers, quite frankly, take a look at what are the essential components of the evidence-based practice, and am I teaching it, most importantly, and then am I allowing an opportunity for candidates to practice that skill so that they can, when they do indeed get hired or in classrooms, can implement it well. If we flip to the next slide, this is just an example of what an IC might look like, and the text is a little bit small, and you might not be able to see a lot of it, but you can go on any of the ICs and see them. But the whole intent here is those essential competencies are listed on the left-hand side. And they basically, through the research, are identifying what are the practices that teachers need to know and be able to do to implement the evidence-based, or this case, reading practices well. And so you see there on the left-hand side, phonetic awareness, phonics, the things that we know through scientifically based reading research are essential for teaching reading. I think the important thing to note, too, across the top, there is a levels of evidence. And basically what that's looking at is how well are we teaching it within our coursework, and then also how well are we aligning our field experiences and opportunities to practice within our coursework to ensure that we're not only teaching about it, but we're providing opportunities for candidates to practice with feedback and support in order to reach a level of fidelity. So it's really, it's not designed to be an evaluative tool, although it could be, although I wouldn't suggest that. It's really designed more to take a look across all of the preparation that we're providing for our candidates, both teachers and leaders, general ed and special ed. How well are we teaching this? Because we can't expect it and evaluate on it if we never taught it to begin with. So these tools are there, and many of our states within their preparation programs are working collaboratively to use these as a way to strengthen their programs. And sometimes that means adding a course, sometimes that means modifying the course content, but it really is a process that is used at the university level to do that. If you click on the next click, it'll show you these are the different innovation configurations that we do have on. If you can just go back, yeah, thank you, have on that are available. So you see certain content areas covered. Again, if you go to the Cedar website, these are available for free. Anybody can use them. And again, even if you're not a faculty member, which these are originally designed for because of the Cedar role and mission, it can be very well used for professional development. So if you have a PD provider coming in, for example, to teach reading instruction, how well is their PD materials aligning to those essential components. And then most importantly, if you're a district administrator and you are thinking about, you know, my reading scores aren't looking very hot, or maybe that's part of your initiative to improve the reading scores of students, all students, including students with disabilities, and I've decided to hire somebody to come in and train my staff. Well, how well is that training aligning to the evidence? And then most importantly, what am I doing as a district administrator to ensure that those teachers have an opportunity to practice those skills and gather feedback in order to improve? That is critically important, and these tools can easily be used in that manner. Next slide. And we didn't want to just stop there either. We didn't want to say, okay, you've got a problem here. You're not teaching evidence-based reading practice in phonetic awareness. That's not part of your curriculum. You haven't taught it. It's not part of your PD. You know, that's one thing. It's just to learn that you need it. But then there's also the next course of, you know, how do I design professional development in courses that really cover the level of depth needed in the evidence-based practice? How do I do it well? And how do I ensure there's opportunities to practice with feedback, et cetera? So Cedar has created what we call course enhancement modules. And basically it takes it to the next step. It includes example syllabi, it has video clips from experts, it has example activities, handouts, and then ultimately you can download a professional learning module that basically provides you a course or a PD activity over a long period of time that provides training on what is the EDP, what's the research behind it, and then most importantly, what does it look like and how do you practice it and how do you continue to improve in it. So it provides everything. You see there's some slides here on the screen. It provides talking points. It provides handouts, materials, and like I mentioned before, it has video clips. It's pretty much everything in a pretty little package. And it's free. It can be used. It can be modified, most importantly, because you need to, as with working with students, same with teachers, you need to understand what their prior knowledge and experiences and what their needs are. So if I were to identify that phonetic awareness is an area that our teachers are struggling with, then I could go into this module and pull out that piece. So it is very customizable, and it's intended to be, but it could be used in full. So I just wanted to pull those out as a huge resource because they could be quite valuable if you at a district or school level and a state level are trying to improve the level of training that teachers get so that you can positively influence the reading outcomes of students. Next slide. And it's important to know this too, because it follows to the theme of what we've been talking about, that we've established these course enhancement modules based on the tiers. So what does math, evidence-based math instruction look like at Tier 1? What does it look like at Tier 2, and what does it look like at Tier 3? Now, there's no scientific cutoff, as you well know. The real cutoff is really understanding if it's working for a student and knowing when you need to go and modify and intensify the services. But we did want to lay it out to some degree so that it was clear, what do you need to do at Tier 1 at core instruction, and then how do you know when you need to go further? And so these course enhancement modules are very much set up like that. And I think it lends itself very well to think through in the way that we design coursework as well as the way we design PD that way. And if you just click one more link, this is where you can find the course enhancement modules. If you go to our website, which you've had links all the way through here, you can go in and just go into resources, tools, and come down to course enhancement modules, and you'll see those listed here. These are the ones that are currently available. And if you click real quick, you'll see that we have one coming up hopefully really soon on reading. And we also have one on leadership, which we haven't talked about yet, but it's important for leaders to really understand what evidence-based practices are and what instruction should look like, most particularly if they're going to come in and evaluate how well you're doing. So again, these are free resources. They can be used and modified at will. So please take a look. And that leads me to the end of core instruction and highlighting a few resources through the Cedar Center. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to talk about Tier 2 and Tier 3.
Thank you, Lynn. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Zimeta Edmonds, and I am the Deputy Director of the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And thank you for allowing me to join you today to talk a bit about our next section, which is thinking about evidence for intervention at the Tier 2 and 3 levels. Sometimes I'll say secondary and intensive intervention to also kind of mean Tier 2 being secondary intervention and Tier 3 being intensive intervention. Next slide, please. So the Tier 2 or secondary prevention level is really intended to target specific skills with standardized, packaged interventions that have evidence of efficacy or that have been rigorously evaluated and shown to work for most students. So these are those packaged programs that you may be familiar with. You may have many of them already on your shelf at school. And they tend to be the most efficient first stop for when you know a child has some intervention needs. And they may need, for example, may need some additional help in phonemic awareness or fluency building or math facts or some specific area of need where a packaged program can kind of help address that particular skill deficit. Because these are packaged, they have a specific scope and sequence, and they're the best aligned to current thinking about what sort of meets that gold standard of evidence that Allison talked about earlier. So really, when they're available, you want these packaged programs that have strong evidence of rigor. Some resources that we have, Nick, if you can move this to the next slide. On the National Center of Intensive Interventions website, we have a tools chart that actually provides reviews of these kinds of intervention programs in reading and mathematics for elementary and middle grades. And they can be these tools charts are very useful because they not only provide information about the quality of the evidence or the quality of the study that was conducted to determine if the program was effective or not. It also gives information about the size of the impact or the effect size. So that means if the kids did better, how much better, and is it enough that I should care about that? And then also information about what it takes to implement the program, how much it costs, what kind of training is involved, the group size needed to implement the program, and so forth. Because those are very important considerations in determining whether or not to adopt a Tier 2 program in a school. But really, the thinking behind these is that they've been rigorously evaluated for at-risk students for which the programs were designed. So when you have a group of at-risk students, your most efficient stop is to try something that we already know through prior testing is likely to work for most kids. At the same time, we know that these programs work for about 80% of at-risk kids. So there are another 20% for whom these kind of standardized package programs are not likely to be enough, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. But again, the goal at the Tier 2 level is to use things that have been evaluated to help us be efficient in getting the most at-risk kids we can using these more efficiently designed programs and leaving individualization and that the data collection that goes along with that to the intensive or Tier 3 level. Next slide, please. So I just noted some resources that have already been mentioned earlier in this webinar for where you can look for information about Tier 2 programs. Again, the tools chart that I linked to in the last slide really provides some nice examples of these kinds of packaged programs, but other services, including the What Works Clearinghouse, the Best Evidence Encyclopedia, the IRIS Center, the EBI Network, the RTI Center, all provide additional information on how to identify and select these kinds of Tier 2 or secondary intervention programs as well, and also about how to look at whether or not the evidence about the quality of these programs really meets the standards of rigor necessary. But what's useful about these resources is that they keep you, the individual teacher or administrator, from having to go to research journals and try to make sense of result sections that may have information that is not aligned with where your training is and where you want to be spending your time. As an entity that provides technical assistance and support and interprets evidence for the field, our role and some of these other organizations' role is to distill that information in a way that is consumable to people who don't have PhDs in statistics or research methodologies, but who do need to be able to take and use that information. And again, the goal of this is to kind of help us be more efficient in providing that information so that the people who are being tasked with using and implementing these programs can actually be spending their time developing their skill set in how to implement these well and then understanding the critical components. Next slide, please. So if, some of you may be familiar with some of these resources already, so we were just interested from for our own learning, which resources do you already use to identify evidence-based practices or curriculum materials for your setting? And go ahead and check all that apply. So we've got the What Works Clearinghouse, the NCII tools chart, information from research journals, recommendations from professional organizations, or other resources. So go ahead and take a moment and respond to the poll, please.
Rebecca, we still have some votes coming in. We're coming up at about 70% of the participants that have voted. 70% are at recommendations from professional organizations, but then we've got 60% at What Works Clearinghouse, 53% at information from research journals, and about 42% from NCII tools charts. So kind of high numbers there, but our biggest two are recommendations from professional organizations and What Works Clearinghouse.
Great. Well, I'm impressed. That's a nice range of tools people are using, and very glad to hear so many people are already familiar with the tools charts because of all the work that we put into those. All right. So again, I think that for those of you who, many of you sound familiar with these resources, you're probably aware of some of the pros and cons of these different strategies for identifying programs. Some of these various resources may be more or less efficient for you for actually finding things that are likely to work for your setting. You may notice in searching for tools for different grade levels and subject areas that there are real limitations on the number of things that meet those most rigorous evidence standards for different populations of students. For example, when we're thinking about primary grade reading, there are a lot of great resources out there and packaged programs that have some strong evidence of effectiveness. However, when we get into middle and upper grades in mathematics or science, content area reading, there are fewer and fewer of those programs. So sometimes we're left asking, okay, well, what do we do when there aren't programs that meet those most rigorous standards? So I think that that's, again, another area where people are struggling with how do we implement high-quality practice that is rooted in evidence in the absence of something that meets those most rigorous standards. Next slide, please. So, Nick, I think you skipped a couple slides.
Are we where we need to be? Sorry.
No. Can you go back one? Okay. Yeah, and that forward. Okay. All right. So, with respect to the Tier 2, and the evidence standards involved, you know, part of how we know something meets these rigorous standards of evidence is that we know the package was implemented the way it was designed, or it meets certain criteria for fidelity of implementation. And again, I think the Tier 2 level is the most easily and logically aligned with how the field more generally talks about both evidence and fidelity monitoring. And this notion that if a program has 6 components, that we implement all 6 components every time, that we deliver the instruction the way it's designed in the user's manual, that the students do all of the activities, that if the program is intended to be delivered 3 days a week for 30 minutes with 4 kids in a group, that's how it's delivered, and that it's not, you know, once a week for half an hour with a group of 15 kids or something like that, that really would deviate from how the package was evaluated and shown to be effective. So it's really critical that when we think about fidelity at the Tier 2 level, that we think about this notion of the schedule, the adherence to the program, and then also whether or not progress monitoring data were collected. Because as I mentioned earlier, even the best designed evidence-based program is unlikely to be effective for all students. From looking at the research literature on intervention research, we know that about 20% of at-risk students do not respond even to well-designed intervention programs. So they need something different. And the way we find that out is by looking at progress monitoring data. Furthermore, there may be circumstances under which the program is not well aligned to your population. For example, a program may have been validated on a population of students that didn't include a large number of English language learners, and you may be teaching a group of students that has a large number of English learners in it. And so you may have reason to believe that your population is not necessarily a match for the population that was studied when the program was evaluated. So it's really important to also implement your own progress monitoring data collection so that you can determine for yourself, is this program working for my students? Okay? And hand in hand with that is, did I deliver the program the way it was designed? Okay, so if I kind of haphazardly do the program every once in a while and my kids aren't making progress, I can't blame the program, right? But if I've implemented the program with Fidelity and I've made sure that that's the case, and I'm taking data and I'm seeing low levels of progress, that gives me more information about whether or not the program is an issue. Now, one thing to think about, however, is if you're working with a group of 5 students and 4 of them are progressing and 1 is not, that may be indicative of a child who needs a more intensive intervention versus a situation where, in taking data, that group of 5 kids has 5 of the kids not making progress. That may be an indication that there's something about the program or the fidelity of implementation that needs to be looked at. So again, the fidelity piece is really important when we think about determining whether or not something is having the impact we want it to for our students. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, when we can get the highest level gold standard rigorous evidence of effectiveness for an intervention program, we should use that information. And if a program has been rigorously evaluated and shown to have a large positive impact, by all means, this is the kind of program we want and that we should look for. However, working in the real world, we know there are limitations of what it means to have this gold standard evidence. As I mentioned earlier about generalizability to other populations, again, you may have a program that's been evaluated with students who speak English only, and your population may be kids who don't speak English or who are learning English. There may be questions about whether or not a particular intervention will translate to your population the way you would hope it would. Also, rigorously evaluated randomized control studies take many, many years to complete. They often cost a million, if not several $1 million. The replications involved can be very time-consuming and expensive. And so because of that, there is often a significant time delay between when a program is initially developed and studied and when it may be ready to be released to the public for more general consumption. And that time delay may mean that there are windows of time in certain, again, subject areas and grade levels where there really are very few, if not no, clearly packaged resources that are good, that we can point to and say, yes, we know this works. And so in the absence of that, we also need to be able to think about how can the data we're collecting in our own context help us determine if that intervention is useful for our students, and how can we look for the best available evidence when this gold standard isn't there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, as we think about kids with intensive needs, this notion of the generally effective intervention is not a universally effective intervention. There are children who will need more, and as I said earlier, it's about 20% of kids who have been identified as at risk who will need a more intensive intervention, no matter how well designed a rigorously evaluated study is. Next slide, please. So this is what brings us to Tier 3, or the most intensive level of intervention. And at the most intensive level, we move away from standardized programs that we saw at Tier 2, and we move into individualized intervention, where we're embedding instructional supports and strategies based on the progress monitoring data we're collecting on the child. This allows us to target how we are intervening with the students and integrate both academic and behavioral supports. And what's critical to this level of intervention, perhaps even more than at the Tier 2 level, is the frequent use of our progress monitoring to determine impact, because this is what's giving us the evidence that what we're doing for this child is having the impact that we want it to. Next slide. So within the National Center on Intensive Intervention, our approach to this is data-based individualization. And this is our graphic that depicts the DBI process. And what you'll see is that at the top, we start with a validated intervention program. That's the Tier 2, okay? So we've used that Tier 2, and we've determined there's 20% of kids that need something more. So we're going to intensify that Tier 2. But we're not going to intensify it by just making a wild guess about what the child needs. Instead, we're going to collect progress monitoring data. If the child's responsive, then great, they stay in that Tier 2. But if they're not responsive, then we collect some more informal diagnostic data. We conduct error analysis of progress monitoring. We may do functional assessment of behavior if there's a social behavior issue that we're concerned about. And we use that information to create a hypothesis about what needs to be changed in the Tier 2 intervention program to make it more intense and more individualized to meet the needs of the student. Based on that hypothesis, we adapt the intervention, we monitor progress, and if we're having the impact that we want, we continue to do what we're doing. But we also continue to take those data so that we know that either the child is progressing and that the program is having the impact that we want. We're collecting our evidence that the program is effective for the student. And if it's not, that we're not continuing to do it. Instead, we're going back to the diagnostic data collection, creating a new hypothesis, and further adapting the intervention. Next slide. So oftentimes we get asked, well, what's the evidence here? Because if I've been told I have to do this packaged intervention with Fidelity, and then I deviate from the program by adapting it, that's not Fidelity anymore. I'm not allowed to do that. Well, we're here to tell you, number one, if the data are showing that the program delivered with Fidelity isn't working, then it's not an evidence-based practice for that student. Okay, and we know that when we validate these programs, there are kids for which this is not going to be sufficient. But there is about 4 decades worth of intervention research that shows this DBI process, when kids are a part of that process where you're combining assessment and intervention and using them in a dynamic way to intensify the program, that you will actually increase learning outcomes for kids with intensive learning needs. But what's also important is that when you're collecting the data in the context of that process, that you're using assessment tools that have evidence of validity and reliability. So that means that they have been designed for the purpose that they're being used for. They're designed for progress monitoring and comparing performance over time. Next slide. So at the Tier 3 level, again, we have multiple resources intended to help support identification of evidence-based practices and strategies at Tier 3. First, we have those academic and behavior intervention programs, and you'll both see the packaged Tier 2 programs on some of these lists, but then you'll also see in the behavior list some information about the evidence behind more non-branded strategies that may be used and embedded into a child's intervention program. We're also working on beginning to add those to the academic tools chart so that there will be not only packaged programs, but information on the research around different kinds of academic intervention strategies. Furthermore, we know that progress monitoring and the use of the data is a critical piece of the DBI process as an evidence-based practice. And so we also provide reviews of progress monitoring tools in academics and behavior to help you identify tools that are valid and reliable for this purpose. Next slide, please. Additional resources on intensive intervention. We have a series of materials on the National Center on Intensive Intervention website, including multiple webinars, an entire training series. We have some sample lessons and behavior support materials that may be downloaded and used for free. We have Ask the Expert videos from which include responses to questions from nationally recognized experts in the field, among a number of other resources on the website. The Center on Instruction, which is no longer funded but has a very nice website, also has a great document that they've developed on designing intensive intervention for students with intensive reading and mathematics needs. And so that's another report that is worth a read if you have the chance. Next slide, please. So at the Tier 3 level, Fidelity starts to look a little different. Because we're adapting the program to meet the needs of an individual student, we're no longer worried necessarily about adherence to a packaged program in the same way we were at the Tier 2 level. So instead, we're asking ourselves, did we do what we said we would do? When we created the plan for this child, did we follow through? If we said we were going to move the intervention schedule to, instead of 3 days a week for 20 minutes, he's now getting 4 days a week for 45 minutes, did we do it? Did we follow the schedule that we laid out? And then again, did we adhere to the individualized plan we set for the student? So if the program was delivered, if the program was written as part of the IEP, then did we follow the IEP the way we said we did? If we said we were going to implement certain intensification strategies, did we follow through? For example, if we said we were going to implement a behavior contract as part of math intervention time, did we implement that contract, and did we do it enough times that the student had a chance to learn what was expected and understand what that behavior contract meant in the context of their day? If we said we were going to build in 5 more minutes of fact practice every day where we gave feedback to the student on their performance, did we do it? If we said we were going to move our progress monitoring data collection from twice a month to once a week, did we do it? So those kind of monitoring of our own execution of the student's plan. And then finally, within the context of intensive intervention, progress monitoring is a critical component. So again, were we following the correct administration and scoring procedures for use of whatever tool it is that we have selected? Next. Because this is kind of a different way of thinking about fidelity, at the NCII we have developed some resources for monitoring fidelity of implementation. First, we have the DBI implementation rubric, and the idea here is to look at how well are we doing as a system at supporting implementation of intensive intervention. So this goes through and looks at fidelity of implementation at the school and district level, and then also in terms of the kinds of progress monitoring tools that are adopted, the way interventions are planned and designed and scheduled, who's delivering the interventions, and so forth. So it's kind of big picture thinking about implementation of this intensive intervention. And then the next slide shows those resources for monitoring that student level fidelity that I mentioned. And these are also available on the NCII website and free for download. And again, this is a place where you can go in and look at, ask yourself questions about, did I execute on the plan I laid out for an individual child? So it's, again, getting at that student level fidelity of implementation of the intervention. So to wrap up, although it would be nice to be able to say that, you know, we can kind of fit tiers 2 and 3 in these nice boxes, where tier 2 is solely about standardized intervention and tier 3 is really about individualized intervention, there do continue to be some challenges, and I think things that both we in the research world and people working, those of us working in the practice world and kind of trying to span the two, really do need to think about as this field moves forward. So at the tier 2 level, again, as I've mentioned, we really want the standardized programs that have evidence of effectiveness for at-risk kids. But a limitation we have is that there just are not those programs available across ages and grades. So we also need to be able to think more broadly about how can we collect high quality, how can we use the high quality evidence that is available to make the best decision with what we have right now. And then again, similarly, thinking about validity across contexts or across different groups of students. What are the kinds of things that, if they've been shown to work with one population of students, are likely to be transportable to other populations, and what are things that we may need to evaluate in other contexts? At the tier 2 level also, as mentioned earlier, sometimes there's a perceived lack of alignment to tier 1 or even to tier 3. So again, building on that understanding of what it is that we're trying to develop skill-wise at the tier 2 level and how that may support kids' ability to access what's going on at the tier 1 or core program level. And then the questions around feasibility of implementation. So what do we do when the Tier 2 program that's shown to work isn't supposed to be delivered for 3 hours a day to groups of 2 kids? How many public schools can actually do that? So how can we be also creating more intervention programs that are allow us to use our resources in an efficient way so that we can reach as many kids as possible? And then finally, what do we do for low incidence populations of kids for whom there may not be enough students to evaluate an intervention in the kind of most rigorous way where we're using a group experimental design? So how do we do rigorous evidence and data collection, evidence and, how do we develop a body of evidence for those populations for, in terms of identifying those kind of packaged intervention programs? Similarly, at the Tier 3 level, part of why we do this kind of adaptation and data collection at the Tier 3 level is, again, there are typically not programs out there that are prepackaged that address the complexity of challenges that kids with intensive and severe and persistent learning needs present with. Very often, children at this level are having co-occurring academic and behavior problems. There may be other kinds of cognitive issues that need to be addressed, such as working memory or attention, that a lot of packaged Tier 2 programs on their own may not address. So that's where this need to build the individualization comes in. But we could also use more research in how to build those kinds of programs more effectively. Similarly, practitioners are often not trained to deliver these kinds of programs or build these kind of programs on their own. And so this is something that is an ongoing need, both in terms of in-service teacher professional development and pre-service teacher training. We also find that progress monitoring tools, while they're widely available at certain grade levels, for example, elementary reading, there are fewer choices as we move into older students, as we look at reading and mathematics. There are materials available, but they do tend to be more limited in scope. And then this perception of what it means to provide off-level instruction and assessment. There's sometimes a belief that if I'm providing instruction and skills, I'm not teaching to the grade level standards. And I think what's important here, too, is to kind of work as a team and as a system to help people also better understand the learning progressions and why, if a student is struggling with fractions, that a Tier 3 program may be addressing things like fluency with division and multiplication facts, or working with understanding fraction magnitude, when the Tier 1 may be working on much more complicated fractions concepts. And so kind of understanding that learning progression and why Tier 3 may need to be really addressing things that are underlying the grade level standard that we want the child to eventually reach. So next slide. We would like at this point to turn it over to the audience for questions, and we realize that there isn't an ability for people to ask questions verbally, but the question box, I believe, has been active, and so I will turn it back over to Sarah to see if there are any questions that have come in.
Sure. Yep. We have a couple that we have indicated to the participants we would talk about at the end. The first couple of questions came up right at the very beginning when we were talking about ESSA and the different kinds of research. We had 3 or 4 questions come in about single case design. Where do single case designs come in? I think, Allison, there might have been a couple of bullets on that in your presentation. So if you could maybe expand a little bit on that. We had some folks ask about single case design and the research around single case design.
Sure. So actually in ESSA, as far as I know, and I actually even did a quick search during the webinar, there's no language in ESSA about where single subject design falls. However, I would say that, typically, especially when you think about the What Works Clearinghouse guidelines, single subject is generally considered among the highest in terms of rigor for a certain type of intervention. So interventions that are designed to be sort of one-on-one with individual students, because you really can't study those with a randomized trial, but you can with a single subject design. So it's kind of just a different way of kind of doing an experimental study on those kinds of interventions. So I would say that probably that would be aligned with the strong category in ESSA. But the other thing I would just say about single subject design that I think is kind of interesting is that, although teachers aren't, doing this kind of rigorous research, the general theory behind single subject designs is very much aligned with what teachers do in Tier 3. I mean, they're essentially gathering data on their students before providing an intervention. They then provide the intervention. They gather more data. They make a change based on that data. They gather more data and then keep making changes. So everything's based on data. So sort of in that way, that kind of aligns to what we've been talking about, the kinds of evidence that is important at Tier 3, which is that really what the teacher is doing and the data that they're collecting, that in itself is the evidence that can support the practice you're doing for your particular child you're working with at Tier 3.
Thank you. We also had a couple of other questions about strategies for schools like title schools or schools where there's a lot of language learners or poverty or trauma, and then we end up often seeing a lot of students in Tier 2 and Tier 3. If anyone had any strategies or resources or ideas to help educators really kind of shore up Tier 1 or to kind of increase the quality of the Tier 1 instruction, especially at title schools.
Well, I think this is where some of the Tier 2 programs or things that may have historically been thought of as Tier 2 programs, but that are packaged to address particular learning needs can be very useful. Some of them really are actually designed for class-wide implementation, so they could be used for teaching at a larger group level. It may also be important to think in those buildings about prioritizing where time is spent on particular high-priority areas of learning. And by that, I don't mean cut out recess, but I do mean when you think about the things that need to be accomplished in a day, if reading's the most important thing, are we making sure that time is protected, that kids are getting the 120 minutes a day that is being prescribed? Are we making sure that we are delivering all components that are recommended by the National Reading Panel? Are we using a core program that has evidence for being effective for kids with kind of learning needs that they're presenting with, and so forth? Oftentimes, basal curriculum materials are not rigorously evaluated as a package, but sometimes they are, and you can also look at whether the components of those programs do meet standards of evidence for rigor and that or are well aligned with the recommendations from reputable professional organizations. So those are some of the things I would recommend doing at the beginning, in addition to taking data and making sure you've got good screening information on students and that you're monitoring their progress.
And I think just to follow up with Rebecca, I think that's where the intersection between the high leverage practices and the evidence-based practices relative to content come into play. So if you think about direct explicit instruction, modeling, quality feedback, all of those things that we know are critically important, but what's the intersection then between how we're providing reading instruction? Because it's as Rebecca said, where you're prioritizing your efforts and how much time, but it's also about the quality of instruction. So how are you ensuring that you're teaching those scientifically based reading components in leveraging those high leverage practices that are evidence-based in terms of, the feedback, the, direct explicit instruction, opportunities to model, scaffolding, all of those things that we know as good teaching. How do you have that intersection between the evidence-based practice? And I think that's where at Tier 1 we can do a much better job generally in making those connections for teachers so that the time that we do have is leveraged to the best degree that we can.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we have about 3 or 4 minutes left. We have tackled, those are both of the questions besides the link to the resources that Lynn was talking about that we sent out earlier. Those were all the questions that we have addressed that we would talk about as a whole group. It looks like there are still a couple coming in, and it looks to me like those are getting answered by just about everyone. So since we have about 3 minutes left, I'll just go ahead and wrap up. Thank our presenters and panelists for sharing that information, and thank you for your participation, for some of the great questions that you asked. and just give you a couple of reminders. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted. We've sent the link out a couple of times to you individually and generally to those of you that have asked. So if you need access to the webinar, that will be posted. We did just get a comment that I'm reading and also trying to talk at the same time. Says that one thing that would help many general education teachers in all schools, but maybe in Title I schools, is to think about combining what Rebecca just said about assistance on how to help structure small group instruction while monitoring a whole class. So sometimes small group instruction and those sorts of things are hard to do at the same time. So teachers sometimes have difficult time running small groups like PALS, class-rated peer tutoring. So those can be sort of specific approaches that can be talked about and thought about, with a comment shared on our chat board through one of the participants. So that could be another component.
Sarah, I think that's a really, really good idea and something we can follow up. And I just, before we close out, wanted to again reference the fact that all three of us represent a number of different nationally funded centers that have a lot of these resources for free and, can provide some level of guidance depending on what level around what we talked about today. So just wanted to also reference the fact that you've got a National Center for Intensive Intervention, National Center for Systemic Improvement, and the Cedar Center that are all national centers to really support this kind of work.
Excellent. That's helpful, Lynn. And again, thank you all. And we're right at about our time. So it looks like we've addressed some of your questions. If you have a question that we didn't answer, we will be posting Q&A and answers to your specific questions, or most of the questions that we received during the webinar. So that will be posted along with the webinar slides and the recording. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, I thank you again for your participation, for our panelists, and I will go ahead and wrap up the day. I hope you have a really nice afternoon, and thanks again for your participation.